Well, good evening, everyone. I'm glad you're here tonight for this here Campfire Stories. You know, we've been talking about this Max Brand story, The Untamed. We've been reading it for, 4 weeks now or so? And there's so much more of this story. So I'm going to try to read you some more of it here. And you guys can just sit back tonight. No stories from you required. You just sit back and enjoy your cup of coffee and maybe a little whiskey in company of others and listen to me tell this here story. Well, we've worked our way up to chapter 9, and that's where I'm going to start. The Phantom Rider. Now, in the daytime, the willows along the wide, level river bottom seemed an unnatural growth, for they made a streak of yellow-green across the mountain desert, when all other verdure withered and died. After nightfall, they became still more dreary. Even when the air was calm, there was apt to be a sound as of the wind, for the tenuous trailing branches brushed lightly together, making kind of a guarded whispering like ghosts. In a small clearing among those willows sat Silent, his companions. A fifth member had just arrived at this rendezvous, answered the quiet greeting with a wave of his hand, and was now busy caring for his horse. Bill Kilduff, who had a natural inclination and a talent for cookery, raked up the death-dying coals of the fire over which he had cooked the supper, and he set about preparing bacon and coffee for the newcomer. The latter came forward and squatted close to the cook. He was just watching the process with a real careful eye. He made a sharp contrast with the rest of the group. From one side of his profile showed the face of a good-natured boy, but when he turned his head, the flicker of the firelight ran down a scar which gleamed in a jagged semicircle from his right eyebrow all the way down to the corner of his mouth. This whole side of his countenance was drawn by the cut, the mouth stretching to a perpetual grimace, and when he spoke, it was as if he were attempting secrecy. The rest of the men waited in patience until he finished eating. Then Silent asked, "What news, Jordan?" Jordan kept his regretful eyes a moment longer on his empty coffee cup. "Well, there ain't a pile to tell," he answered at last. "I suppose you heard what happened to that chap you beat up at Morgan's place the other day." "Who knows that I beat him up?" asked Silent sharply. "Nobody," said Jordan, "but when I heard the description of the man that hit Whistlin Dan with the chair, I knew it was Jim Silent." "Well, what about Barry?" asked Haynes, but Jordan still kept his eyes upon the chief. "They was saying pretty general," he went on, "that you needed that chair, Jim. Is that right?" The other three glanced covertly to each other. Silent's hand bunched into a great fist. "He went loco. I had to slam him." "Was he hurt bad?" "Well, the cut on his head wasn't much, but he was left lying in the saloon that night. And the next morning, old Joe Cumberland, not knowing that Whistlin Dan was in there, he come down and touched a match to the old joint. She went up in smoke and took Dan along." Now no one spoke for a moment. Then Silent cried out, "Then what was that whistling I heard down the road behind us?" Bill Kilduff broke into rolling bass laughter, and Hal Purvis chimed in with a squeaking tenor. "We told you all along, Jim," said Purvis, as soon as he could control his voice, "that there wasn't any whistling behind us. We know you got powerful good hearing, Jim, but we all figure you been making something out of nothing. Am I right, boys?" "You sure are," said Kilduff. "I ain't heard a thing." Silent rolled his eyes angrily from face to face. "I'm kind of sorry the lad got his in the fire. I was hoping maybe we'd meet again. There's nothing I'd rather do than be alone 5 minutes with Whistlin Dan." His eyes dared anyone to smile. The men merely exchanged glances. Then he turned away. They grinned broadly. Hal Purvis turned and caught Bill Kilduff by the shoulder. "Bill," he said excitedly, "if Whistlin Dan is dead, there ain't any master for that dog." "What about him?" growled Kilduff. "I'd like to try my hand with him," said Purvis, and he moistened his tight lips. "Did you see that black devil when he snarled at me in front of Morgan's place? He sure didn't look too pleasant." "Right. Maybe if I had him on a chain, I could change his manners some, huh? Now how's that?" A whip every day, damn him. A whip every time he showed his teeth at me. No eats till he whined and licked my hand. He'd die first. I know that kind of dog, or a wolf. Maybe he'd die. Anyway, I'd like to try my hand with him, Bill. I'm going to go and get a hold of him, and one of these days I'd have to ride 100 miles and swim a river. Kilduff grunted. Let the damn wolf be. You can have him, I say. What I'm thinking about is that hoss. Hal, do you remember the way he settled to his stride when he lighted out after Red Pete? Purvis shrugged his shoulders. You're a fool, Bill, which no man but Barry could ever ride that hoss. I seen it in his eye. He'd cash in, Buck, and he'd fight you like a man. Kilduff sighed. Great yearning was in his eyes. Hal, he said softly, they's some men go around for years and hunting for a girl whose picture is in their bean, cached away somewhere. When they see her, they just naturally go nutty. Hell, I don't give a damn for women folk, but I've traveled around a long time with a picture of a hoss in my brain, and Satan is that hoss. He closed his eyes. I can see him now. I can see them shoulders and that head, and my God, them eyes, them fire-eating eyes. Hal, if a man was to win the heart of that hoss, he'd lay down his life for you. He'd run himself plumb to death. I won't never sleep tight till I get the feel of them satin sides of his between my knees. Lee Haines heard him speak, but he said nothing. His heart also leaped when he heard of Whistlin Dan's death, but he thought neither of the horse nor the dog. He was seeing that yellow hair and the blue eyes of Kate Cumberland. He approached Jordan and took a place beside him. Tell me some more about it, Terry, he asked. Some more about what? About Whistlin Dan's death, about the burning of the saloon, said Haines. What the hell, are you still thinking about that? I certainly am. Then I'll trade you news, said Terry Jordan, lowering his voice so that it would not reach the suspicious ear of Jim Silent. I'll tell you about the burning if you'll tell me something about Barry's fight with Silent. It's a trade, answered Haines. All right. Seems old Joe Cumberland had a hunch to clean up the landscape, old fool. So he's just up in the morning and without saying a word to anyone, he downs to the saloon and touches a match to it. And when he come back to his house, he tells his girl Kate what he done. With that, she lets out a holler and drops in a faint. Haines muttered. What's the matter? Asked Terry, a little anxiously. Nothing, said Haines. She fainted, eh? Well, good. Yep, she fainted, and when she come to, she told Cumberland that Dan was in the saloon and he was probably too weak to get out of the fire. They started for the place on the run. When they got there, all they found was a pile of red-hot coals. So everyone figures that he went up in the flames. That's all I know. Now, what about that fight? Lee Haines sat with fixed eyes. There isn't much to say about the fight, he said at last. The hell there isn't, scoffed Terry Jordan. From what I heard, this Whistlin Dan simply cut loose and raised the devil more general than a dozen mavericks corralled with a bunch of yearlings. Cutting loose is right, said Haines. It wasn't a pleasant thing to watch. One moment he was about as dangerous as an 18-year-old girl. The next second, he was like a panther that's tasted blood. That's all there was to it, Terry. After that first blow, he was all over the chief. You know Silent's a bad man with his hands. Well, I guess we all know that, said Jordan with a significant smile. Well, said Haines, he was like a baby in the hands of Barry. I don't like to talk about it. None of us do. It makes the flesh creep. There was a loud crackling among the underbrush several hundred yards away. It drew closer, and it drew louder. Start up your works again, will you, Bill? Called Silent. Here comes Shorty Reinhardt, and he's overdue. In a moment, Shorty swung from his horse and joined the group. He gained his nickname from his excessive length, being taller by an inch or two than Jim Silent himself. But what he gained in height, he lost in width. Even his face was monstrously long and marked with such sad lines that his favorite name of Shorty was affectionately varied to Sourface or Calamity. Silent went to him at once. You seen Hardy? He asked. I sure did, said Reinhardt, and it's the last time I'll make that trip to him, you can lay to that. Did he give you the dope? No. What do you mean? I just want you to know that this here's my last trip to Elkhead on any business. Why? I passed 3 marshals on the street, and I knew 'em all. They was my friends formerly. One of 'em was, what did they do? I waved my hand to 'em, glad and familiar. They just grunted. One of 'em, he looked me up and down the street, and seeing that no one was in sight, he come up to me, and without shaking hands, he says, "I'm some surprised to see you in Elkhead, Shorty." "Why?" says I. "The town's all right, ain't it?" "Oh, it's all right," he says, "but you'd find it a pile more healthier out on the range." "What in the hell do you mean by that?" growled Silent. He simply meant that they're beginning to think a lot more about us than they used to. We've been pulling too many jobs the last 6 months. You've said all that before, Shorty. I'm running this gang. Tell me about Hardy. Well, I'm coming to that. I went into the Wells Fargo office down by the railroad, and the clerk sent me back to find Hardy in the back room. That's where he generally is. And when he seen me, he changed color. I'd just popped my head through the door and sung out, "Hello, Hardy, how's the boy?" He jumped up from the desk and sung out so his clerk in the outside room could hear, "How are you, lad?" And he pulled me quick into the room and locked the door behind me. "Now what in hell have you come to Elkhead for?" says he. "For a drink," says I, never batting an eye. "You've come a damn long ways," said he. "Sure," says I, "that's one reason I'm so dry. Will you liquor, pal?" He looks like he needed a drink, all right. He begun loosening his shirt collar. "Thanks, but I ain't drinking," says he. "Look here, Shorty. Are you loco to come riding into Elkhead this way?" "I'm just beginning to think maybe I am," says I. "Shorty," he says in a whisper, "they're beginning to get wise to the whole gang, including me. Take a brace," says I. "They ain't got a thing on you, Hardy." "That don't keep 'em from thinking a hell of a pile," says he. "And I tell you, Shorty, I'm just about through with this whole works. It ain't worth it. Not if there was $1 million in it. Everybody is getting wise to Silent, and the rest of you. Pretty soon hell's gonna bust loose." "You've been saying that for 2 years," says I. He stopped and looked at me sort of thoughtful and pitying. Then he steps up close to me and he whispers in that voice, "Do you know who's on Silent's trail now, eh?" "No, and I don't give a damn," says I, free and careless. "Tex Calder," says he. Silent started violently and his hands moved instinctively to his 6-gun. "Did he say Tex Calder?" "He said no less," answered Shorty Reinhardt, and he waited to see his news take effect. Silent stood with his head bowed, scowling. "Tex Calder's a fool," he said at last. "He ought to know better than to take my trail." "He's fast with his gun," suggested Shorty. "Don't I know that?" said Silent. "If Alvarez and Bradley and Hunter and God knows how many more could come up out of their graves, they'd tell us just how quick he is with the 6-gun. But I'm the one man on the range that's faster." Shorty was eloquently mute. "I ain't asking you to take my word for it," said Jim Silent. "Now that he's after me, I'm glad of it. It had to come someday. The mountain ain't big enough for both of us to go ranging forever. We had to lock horns someday, and I say God help Tex Calder." He turned abruptly to the rest of the men. "Boys, I got something to tell you that Shorty just heard. Tex Calder's after us." There came a fluent outburst of cursing. Silent went on. "I know just how slick Calder is. I'm betting on my draw to be just the necessary half a hair quicker. He may die shooting. I don't lay no bets that I can nail him before he gets his iron out of its leather. But I say he'll be shooting blind when he dies. Is there anyone taking that bet?" His eyes challenged them from one after another. Their glances traveled past Silent as if they were telling over and over to themselves the stories of those many men to whom Tex Calder had played the part of fate. The leader turned back to Shorty Reinhardt. "Now tell me what he had to say about the coin." "Hardy says the shipment's delayed. He don't know how long." "Well, how'd it come to be delayed?" "Well, he figures that Wells Fargo got a hunch that Silent was laying for the train that was to carry it in." "Will he let us know when it does come through?" "I asked him and he just hedged. He's a quitting on us cold." "I was a fool to send you, Shorty. I'm going myself, and if Hardy don't come back through—" He broke off and announced to the rest of the gang that he intended to make the journey to Elkhead. He told Haynes, who in such cases usually acted as lieutenant, to take charge of the camp. Then he saddled his roan. In the very act of pulling up the cinch of his saddle, Silent stopped short, turned, and raised his hand for quiet. The rest were instantly still. Hal Purvis leaned his weazened face towards the ground. In this manner it was sometimes possible to detect far-off sounds, which to one erect would be inaudible. In a moment, however, he straightened up, shaking his head. "What is it?" whispered Haines. "Shut up," muttered Silent, and the words were formed by the motion of his lips rather than through any sound. That damned whistling again. Every face changed. At a rustling in nearby willow, Terry Jordan started and then cursed softly to himself. That broke the spell. "It's the whispering of the willows," said Purvis. "You lie," said Silent hoarsely. "I heard the sound growing closer." "Barry is dead," said Haines. Silent whipped out his revolver, then shoved it back into his holster. "Stand by me, boys," he pleaded. "It's the ghost come to haunt me. You can't hear it 'cause he ain't come for you." They stared at him with a fascinated horror. "How do you know it's him?" asked Shorty Reinhardt. "There ain't no sound in the whole world like it. It's a sort of cross between the singing of a bird and the wailing of the wind. It's the ghost of Whistlin Dan." The tall roan raised its head and whinnied softly. It was an unearthly effect, as if the animal heard the sound which was inaudible to all but his master. It changed Jim Silent into a quavering coward. Here were 5 practiced fighters who feared nothing between heaven and hell, but what could they avail him against a bodiless spirit? The whistling stopped. He breathed again, but only for a moment. It began again, and this time much louder and nearer. Surely the others must hear it now, or else it was certainly a ghost. The men sat with dilated eyes for an instant, and then Hal Purvis cried, "I heard it, Chief. If it's a ghost, it's haunting me, too." Silent cursed loudly in his relief. "It ain't a ghost, it's Whistlin Dan himself, and Terry Jordan has been carrying us lies. What in hell do you mean by it?" "I ain't carrying you lies," said Jordan hotly. "I told you what I heard. I didn't never say that there was anyone seen his dead body." Now the whistling began to die out. A babble of conjecture and exclamation broke out, but Jim Silent, still sickly white around the mouth, swung up into the saddle. "That Whistlin Dan I'm leaving to you, Haines," he called. "I've had his blood once, and if I meet him again, there's going to be another notch filed into my shooting iron." Chapter 10. The Strength of Women. He rode swiftly into the dark of the willows, and the lack of noise told that he was picking his way carefully among the bended branches. "Now it seems to me," said Terry Jordan, "which I'm not suggesting anything, but it does seem to me that the chief was in a considerable hurry to leave the camp." "He was," said Hal Purvis, "and if you seen that play in Morgan's place, you wouldn't be wondering why. If I was the chief, I'd do the same." "Now, me speaking personal," remarked Shorty Reinhardt, "I ain't laying out to be no man-eater like the chief, but I ain't seen the man that'd make me take to the timbers that way. I don't noways expect there is such a man." "Shorty," said Haines calmly, "we all know that you're quite a man, but you and Terry are the only ones of us who are surprised that Silent slid away. The rest of us who saw this Whistlin Dan in action aren't a bit inclined to wonder. Suppose you were to meet the Black Panther down here in the willows. I wouldn't give a damn if I had my Winchester with me." "All right, Terry, but suppose the Panther," broke in Hal Purvis, "could sling shooting irons as well as you could. Maybe that'd make you particular pleased." "It ain't possible," said Terry. "Sure it ain't," grinned Purvis amiably. "And this Barry ain't possible either. Were you going, Lee?" Lee turned from his task of saddling his mount. "Private matter, Kilduff. You take my place while I'm gone. I may be back tomorrow night. The chief isn't apt to return so soon." A few moments later, Haines galloped out of the willows and headed across the hills toward old Joe Cumberland's ranch. He was remembering his promise to Kate, to keep Dan out of danger. He had failed from that promise once, but that did not mean that he had forgotten. He looked up to the yellow bright mountain stars, and they were like the eyes of a good woman smiling down upon him. He guessed that she loved Barry, and if he could bring her to Whistlin Dan, she might have the strength enough to take the latter from Silent's trail. The lone rider knew well enough that to bring Dan and Kate together was to surrender his own shadowy hopes. But the golden eyes of the sky encouraged him, so he followed his impulse. Now Haines could never walk that middle path, which turns neither to the right nor to the left, neither up, neither down. He went through life with a free swinging stride, and as a result of it, he had crossed the rights of others. He might have lived in a lawful way, for all his instincts they were gentle, but an accident placed him in the shadow of the law. He waited for his legal trial, but when it came and false witnesses placed him behind the bars, the revolt came. 2 days after his confinement, he broke away from this prison and went to the wilds, and that's where he found Jim Silent, and the mountain desert found another to add to its list of great outlaws. Morning came as he drew close to the house, and now his reminiscences were cut short. For at a turn of the road he came upon Kate galloping swiftly over the hills. He drew his horse to halt and raised his hand. She followed suit. They sat staring. If she had remembered his broken promise and started to reproach, he could have found answer. But her eyes were big with sorrow. Sorrow alone. He put out his hand without a word. She hesitated over it, her eyes questioning him mutely, and then with the ghost of a smile she touched his fingers. I want to explain, he said huskily. What? You remember I gave you my word that no harm would come to Barry. No man could have helped him, she said. You don't hold it against me? A gust of wind moaned around them. She waved her arm toward the surrounding hills. Her laugh blended with the sound of the wind. It was so faint. He watched her with a curious pang. She seemed among women what that morning was to the coming day. Fresh, cool, aloof. It was hard to speak the words which would banish the sorrow from her eyes and make them brilliant with hope, and shut him away from her thoughts with a barrier higher than mountains and broader than seas. I have brought you news, he said at last, reluctantly. She did not change. About Dan Barry. Aye, she changed swiftly enough at that. He could not meet the fear and the question of her glance. He looked away. He saw the red rim of the sun pushing up over the hills, and color poured up the throat of Kate Cumberland, up even to her forehead beneath the blowing golden hair. Haines jerked his sombrero lower on his head. A curse tumbled up to his lips, and he had to set his teeth to keep it back. But I have heard his whistle. Her lips moved but made no sound. 5 other men heard him. She cried out as if he had hurt her, but the hurt was happiness. He knew it and he winced, for she was wonderfully beautiful. In the willows of the river bottom, a good 20 miles south, he said at last, and I will show you the way if you wish. He watched her eyes grow large with doubt. Can you trust me, he asked. I failed you once. Can you trust me now? Her hand went out to him. With all my heart, she said. Let us start. Now, I've given my horse a hard ride. He must have some rest. She moaned softly in her impatience, and then, we'll go back to the house. You can stable your horse there until you're ready to start. Dad will go with us. Your father cannot go, he said shortly. Cannot? Let's start back for the ranch, he said, and I'll tell you something about it as we go. As they turned their horses, he went on. In order that you may reach Whistlin Dan, you'll have to meet first a number of men who are camping down there in the willows. He stopped. It became desperately difficult for him to go on. I am one of those men, he said, and another of them is the one whom Whistlin Dan is following. She caught her breath and turned abruptly on him. What are you, Mr. Lee? Very slowly, he forced his eyes up to meet her gaze. In that camp, he answered directly, your father wouldn't be safe. It was out at last. Then you are, I'm your friend. Forgive me, you are my friend? The man whom Dan is following, he went on, is the leader. If he gives the command, 4 practiced fighters pit themselves against Barry. It is murder. You can prevent it, he said. They know Barry is on the trail, but I think they will do nothing unless he forces them into trouble. And he will force them unless you stop him. No other human being could take him off that trail. I know, she muttered, but I have already tried, and he will not listen to me. But he will listen to you, insisted Haynes, when you tell him that he will be fighting not one man, but 6. And if he doesn't listen to me? Haynes shrugged his shoulders. Can't you promise that these men will not fight with him? I cannot. But I shall plead with them myself. He turned to her in alarm. No, you must not let them dream that you know who they are, he warned. For otherwise, again, that significant shrug of the shoulders. He explained, these men are in such danger that they dare not take chances. You are a woman, but if they feel that you suspect them, you will no longer be a woman in their eyes. Then what must I do? I shall ride ahead of you when we come to the willows. After I have pointed out the position of our camp, about an hour after I have arrived, for they must not know that I have brought you, you will ride down towards the camp. When you come to it, I will make sure that it is I who will bring you in. You must pretend that you have simply blundered upon our fire. Whatever you do, never ask a question while you're there. And I'll be your warrant that you will come off safely. Will you try? He attempted no further persuasion and contented himself with merely meeting the wistful challenge of her eyes. I will, she said at last, and then turning her glance away, she repeated softly, I will. He knew that she was already rehearsing what she must say to Whistlin Dan. You're not afraid? She smiled. Do you really trust me as far as this? With level-eyed tenderness that took his breath, she answered, An absolute trust, Mr. Lee. My name, he said in a strange voice, is Lee Haynes. Of one accord they stopped their horses and their hands met. Chapter 11. The Silent Bluffs. The coming of the railroad had changed Elkhead from a mere crossing of the ways to a rather important cattle shipping point. Now, once a year, it became a bustling town whose 2 streets thronged with cattlemen with pockets burdened with gold, which fairly burned its way out into the open air. At other times, Elkhead dropped back into a leaden-eyed sleep. The most important citizen was Lee Hardy, the Wells Fargo agent. Office jobs are hard to find in the mountain desert, and those who hold them win respect. The owner of a swivel chair is more lordly than the possessor of 5,000 dogies. Lee Hardy had such a swivel chair. Moreover, since large shipments of cash were often directed by Wells Fargo to Elkhead, Hardy's position was really more significant than the size of the village suggested. As a crowning stamp upon his dignity, he had a clerk who handled the ordinary routine of work in the front room. Now, while Hardy set himself up in state in a little rear office whose walls were decorated by 2 brilliant calendars and a colored photograph of a blonde beauty advertising a toilet soap. To this sanctuary he retreated during the heat of the day, while in the morning and evening he loitered on the small porch chatting with passers-by. Except in the hottest part of the year, he affected a soft white collar with a permanent bow tie. The leanness of his features and his crooked neck, the prominent Adam's apple which stirred when he spoke, suggested a Yankee ancestry, but the faded blue eyes, pathetically misted, could only be found in the mountain desert. One morning into the inner sanctum of his dignity stepped a man built in rectangles, square face, square, ponderous shoulders, and even square-tipped fingers. Into the smiling haze of Hardy's face, his own keen black eyes sparkled like an electric lantern flashed into a dark room. He was dressed in a cowboy's costume, but there was no western languor in his makeup. Everything about him was clear-cut and precise. He had a habit of clicking his teeth as he finished a sentence. In a word, when he appeared in the doorway, Lee Hardy woke up. And before the stranger had spoken a dozen words, the agent was leaning forward to be sure that he would not miss a syllable. "You're Lee Hardy, aren't you?" said he, and his eyes gave the impression of a smile, though his lips did not stir after speaking. I am, said the agent. Then you're the man I want to see, if you don't mind. He closed the door, pulled a chair against it, then sat down and folded his arms. Very obviously, he meant business. Hardy switched his position in his chair, sitting a little more to the right so that the edge of the seat would not obstruct the movement of his hand toward the holster on his right thigh. Well, he said good-naturedly, I'm waiting. Good, said the stranger. I won't keep you here any longer than is necessary. In the first place, my name is Tex Calder. Hardy changed as if a slight layer of dust had been sifted over his face. He stretched out his hand. It's great to see you, Calder, he said. Of course, I've heard about you. Everyone has here. I'll send over to the saloon for some red-eye. Are you dry? He rose, but Calder waved him back to the swivel chair. Not dry a bit, he said cheerily. Not 5 minutes ago I had a drink. Water. All right, said Hardy, and settled back into his chair. Hardy, there's been crooked work around here. What in hell? Now get your hand away from that gun, friend. What the devil's the meaning of all this? Yeah, that's very well done, said Calder, but this isn't the stage. Are we going to talk business like friends? I got nothing agin you, said Hardy testily, and his eyes followed Calder's right hand as if fascinated. What do you want to say? I'll listen. I'm not very busy. Well, that's exactly it, smiled Tex Calder. I want you to get busier. Thanks. In the first place, I'll be straight with you. Wells Fargo hasn't sent me here. Who has? My conscience. I don't get your drift. Through a moment of pause, Calder's eyes searched the face of Hardy. You've been pretty flush for some time. I ain't been starving. There are several easy ways for you to pick up extra money. Yes? For instance, you know all about the Wells Fargo money shipments, and there are men around here who'd pay big for what you could tell them. The prominent Adam's apple rose and fell in Hardy's throat. You're quite a joker, aren't you, Calder? Who, for instance? Jim Silent. This is like a story in a book, grinned Harvey. Go on. I suppose I've been taking Silent's money? The answer came like the click of a cocked revolver. You have. By God, Calder. Steady, I have some promising evidence, partner. Would you like to hear part of it? This country has its share of the world's greatest liars, says Hardy. I don't care what you've heard. Well, that saves my time. Understand me straight. I can slap you into a lockup if I want to, and then bring in that evidence. I'm not going to do it. I'm going to use you as a trap, and through you get some of the worst of the lone riders. There's nothing like putting your hands on the table. No, there isn't, and I'll tell you what you're to do. Thanks. The marshal drove straight on. I've got 4 good men in this town. 2 of them will always be hanging around your office. Maybe you can get a job for them here, huh? I'll pay the salaries. You simply tip them off when your visitors are riding the government wants, see? You don't have to lift a hand. You just go to the door as the visitor leaves, and if he's all right, you say, so long, we'll be meeting again 'fore long. But if he's a man I want, you say goodbye. That's all. My boys will see that it is goodbye. Go on, said the agent, and tell me the rest of the story. It starts well. Doesn't it, agreed Calder? And the way it concludes is with you reaching over and shaking hands with me and saying yes. He leaned forward. The twinkle had gone from his eyes, and he extended his hand to Hardy. The latter reached out with an impulsive gesture, wrung the proffered hand, and then slipping back into his chair, broke into hysterical laughter. The real laugh, said Calder, watching this man closely, will be on the long riders. Tex, said the agent, I guess you have the dope. I won't say anything except that I'm glad as hell to be out of the rotten business at last. Once started, I couldn't stop. I did one favor for these devils, and after that they had me in their power. I haven't slept for months, as I'm going to sleep tonight. He wiped his face with an agitated hand. A week ago, he went on, I knew you was detailed on this work, and I've been sweating ever since. Now that you've come, why, I'm glad of it. A faint sneer touched Calder's mouth and was gone. You're a wise man, he said. Have you seen much of Jim Silent lately? Hardy hesitated. The role of informer was new. Well, not directly. Calder nodded. Now put me right if I go off the track. Now, the way I understand it, Jim Silent has about 20 gunfighters and long riders working in gangs under him and combining for big jobs. That's about it. The inside circle consists of Silent, Lee Haynes, a man who went wrong because the law did him wrong, Hal Purvis, a cunning devil, and Bill Kilduff, a born fighter who loves blood for its own sake. Right? Well, here's something more. For Jim Silent, dead or alive, the government will pay $10,000. For each of the other three, it'll pay $5,000. The notices aren't out yet, but they will be in a few days. Hardy, if you help me bag these men, you'll get 50% of the profits. Are you on? The hesitancy of Hardy changed to downright enthusiasm. Easy money, Tex. I'm your man, hands and glove. Don't get optimistic. This game isn't played yet. Unless I make the biggest mistake of my life, we'll be guessing again before we land Silent. I've trailed some fast gunmen in my day, and I have an idea that Silent will be the hardest of the lot. But if you play your end of the game, we may land him. I have a tip that he's lying out in the country near Elkhead. I'm a-riding alone to get track of him. As I go out, I'll tell my men that you're okay for this business. He hesitated a moment with his hand on the doorknob. Just one more thing, Hardy. I heard a queer tale this morning about a fight in a saloon run by a man named Morgan. Do you know anything about it? No? Well, I was told of a fellow who chipped $4 thrown into the air at 20 yards. Well, that's a lie. Well, the man who talked to me had a nicked dollar to prove his yarn. The devil he did. And after the shooting, this chap got into a fight with a tall man twice his size and fairly mopped up the floor with him. They say it wasn't a nice thing to watch. He's a frail man, but when the fight started, he turned into a tiger. Boy, I wish I'd seen it. The tall man tallies to a hair with my description of Silent. You're wrong. I know what Silent can do with his hands. No one could beat him up. What's the name of the other? Barry. Whistlin Dan Barry. Calder hesitated. Right or wrong, I'd like to have this Barry with me. So long. He was gone as he had come, with a nod and a flash of the keen black eyes. Lee Hardy stared at the door for some moments, and then went outside. The warm light of the sun had never been more welcome to him. Under that cheering influence, he began to feel that with Tex Calder behind him, he could safely defy the world. His confidence received a shock that afternoon when a heavy step crossed the outside room, and his door opening without a preliminary knock, he looked up into the solemn eyes of Jim Silent. The outlaw shook his head when Hardy offered him a chair. What's the main idea of them two new men out in your front room? Lee, he asked. Two cowpunchers that was down on their luck. I got to stand in with those boys now and then. I suppose so. Shorty Reinhardt in here to see you, Lee? Yep. You told him that the town was getting pretty hot? It is. You said you had no dope on when that delayed shipment was coming through. Hardy made a lightning calculations. A half-truth would be the best way out. I've just got the word you want. It came this morning. Silent's expression changed and he leaned a little closer. It's the 19th. Train number 89, savvy? 7 o'clock at Elkhead. How much? Same bunch of coin? 50,000. That's 10 more. Yep. A new shipment rolled in with the old one. No objections. Silent grinned. Any other news, Lee? Shorty told you about Tex Calder. He did. Seen him around here? The slightest fraction of a second in hesitation. No. Was that the straight dope you gave Shorty? Straighter than hell. They're beginning to talk, but I guess I was just sort of panicky when I talked with Shorty. Now, this Tex Calder, what about him? This with a trace of suspicion. He's got a long record. Well, so have you, Jim. Once more that wolf-like grin which had no mirth. So long, Lee. I'll be on the job. Late to that. He turned towards the door. Hardy followed him. A moment more and a single word and the job would be done. $5,000 for a single word. It warmed the very heart of Lee Hardy. Silent, as he moved away, seemed singularly thoughtful. He hesitated a moment with bowed head at the door. Then he whirled and shoved a 6-gun under the nose of Hardy. The latter leaped back with his arms thrust above his head, straining at his hands to get them higher. "My God, Jim!" "Why, you low-down lying hound." Hardy's tongue clove at the roof of his mouth. "Damn you, do you hear me?" "Yes, for God's sakes, Jim, don't shoot. Your life ain't worth a dime. Give me one more chance and I'll play square." A swift change came over the face of Silent, and then Hardy went hot with terror and anger. The long rider had known nothing. The gunplay had been a mere bluff, but he had played into the hands of Silent, and now his life was truly worth nothing. "You poor fool," went on Silent, his voice purring with controlled rage. "You damn blind fool. Do you think you could double-cross me and get by with it? Give me a chance, Jim. One more chance. One more chance." Even in his terror, he remembered to keep his voice low, lest those in the front room should hear. "Out with it, if you love living. I can't talk while you got that gun on me." Silent not only lowered his gun, but actually returned it to his holster. Nothing could more clearly indicate his contempt, and Hardy, in spite of his fear, crimsoned with shame. "It was Tex Calder," he said at last. Silent started a little, and his eyes narrowed again. "What of him?" "He came here a while ago and tried to make a deal with me." "And made it," said Silent ominously. No gun pointed at him this time, but Hardy jerked his hands once more above his head and cowered against the wall. "So help me God, he didn't, Jim. Get your hands down." He lowered his hands slowly. "I told him I didn't know nothing about you. What about that train? What about that shipment? It's just the way I told you, except that it's on the 18th instead of the 19th. Now, I'm going to believe you. If you double-cross me, I'll have your hide. Maybe they'll get me, but there'll be enough of my boys left to get you. You can lay to that. How much did they offer you, Lee? How much am I worth to little old USA? It wasn't the money. I was afraid to stick with my game any longer." The long rider had already turned towards the door, making no effort to keep his face to the agent. The latter, flushing again, moved his hands towards his hip, but stopped the movement. The last threat of Silent carried a deep conviction with it. He knew that the faith of lone riders to each other was an inviolable bond. Accordingly, he followed at the heels of the other man into the outside room. "So long, old-timer," he called, slapping Silent on the shoulder. "I'll be seeing you again 'fore long." Calder's men looked up with curious eyes. Hardy watched Silent swing onto his horse and gallop down the street. Then he went hurriedly back in his office. Once inside, he dropped into the big swivel chair, buried his face in his arms, and wept like a child. Well, folks, that's a pretty good evening. I'm going to sit down and have me a cup of something nice like y'all are doing. Maybe somebody else wants to tell a story. Well, until next week, this is Clay Steele, and we'll tell some more stories. Come on back.